Just a nurse. That's what Derek Pierce thought as he watched her arrange organic produce under the fluorescent glare of the Atlanta Whole Foods overnight shift. She moved through the produce section at 2:47 in the morning, her movements precise and economical, no wasted motion, hands that seemed to know exactly where each item belonged before her brain caught up. Pierce sat in his office on the second floor, watching through the security camera feed, his fingers drumming against a clipboard thick with incident reports. Phantom injuries. Fictitious workplace accidents. 2 years of creative billing that had netted him roughly $840,000 siphoned directly from the corporate workers' compensation insurance pool. He'd been careful. Strategic. Until Rachel Torres walked in with her nursing degree and her quiet competence and her way of noticing things other people missed. She didn't know who he was yet. That was the advantage. Rachel moved through the store like someone performing a mission, not a job, shoulders back, head on a swivel, always aware of exits and obstacles, the way someone carries themselves when they've been trained to anticipate threats. Her left leg bore weight slightly less than her right, a minor limp that most people wouldn't catch, but Pierce noticed everything. She wore her Whole Foods uniform like it was a disguise, something she'd pulled on without conviction, and when she thought no one was looking, her fingers would move across the produce in ways that suggested she'd handled far more delicate things than heirloom tomatoes. 3 weeks. She'd been working here for 3 weeks, and already Pierce had felt the shift in atmosphere, her employees actually asking for her opinion on food safety, customers requesting to speak with her about medication interactions, the store manager mentioning that maybe Rachel should be cross-trained for the pharmacy section. Not happening. Not on Pierce's watch. The fluorescent lights buzzed their tired mechanical hum as Rachel finished the organic green section, each bundle of kale arranged with the precision of someone stacking medical supplies. The white noise of the refrigeration units hummed beneath everything else, a constant drone that never quite faded into the background. She reached for the inventory tablet clipped to her apron, her eyes scanning the numbers, cross-checking quantities against what she saw on the shelves. That was new. That was dangerous. The previous stockers never bothered with accuracy, they shoved product and moved on. But Rachel actually counted things. Rachel actually thought about systems and efficiency and whether numbers added up. Pierce descended from his office at 3 o'clock, the metal stairs groaning under his weight, his shoes clicking against each step with deliberate noise. He wanted her to hear him coming. Control, he understood, was largely about making people aware of your presence before you arrived. Rachel looked up from the spinach section, her expression neutral, her body language appropriately deferential. Rachel! Pierce's voice carried the particular tone of someone who'd never been told no. How's the inventory going? Everything's accounted for, Mr. Pierce. She straightened, tablet in hand, her voice soft and even. Though I noticed some discrepancies in the incident reports from last month. In the system. During my training orientation. There it was. The moment Pierce had been dreading. His jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral, let his eyes go cold and measuring. Discrepancies. The July 14th report listed a back strain from lifting, Rachel continued, matter-of-fact, not accusatory. But the weight limit on those boxes is listed at 20 pounds, and the incident report says an associate pulled 50 pounds from an overhead shelf. That violates the safety protocol we went over during onboarding. You reviewing incident reports now? Pierce's tone dropped, became heavier, the way a predator's presence fills a room. That's not part of your job, Ms. Torres. No, sir. It came up during my training modules. I was making sure I understood the procedures correctly. But she had noticed. And the problem with people with actual medical training is that they understood liability. They understood that incident reports matter. They understood that inconsistencies weren't accidents, they were evidence. Pierce stepped closer, and Rachel held her ground, which was the correct choice, the submissive choice, but her eyes tracked his movement with the precision of someone trained in threat assessment. I appreciate your diligence, Pierce said, and every word was a threat wrapped in professional courtesy. But moving forward, focus on the produce. The incident reports are handled by management. That's my responsibility. Clear. Crystal clear, Mr. Pierce. He watched her for another moment, letting the silence sit heavy between them, then turned and walked back toward his office. He needed to be more careful now. Rachel Torres was a problem, but problems could be managed. The trick was being strategic about it. For the next 2 hours, Rachel continued her shift in silence, the only sounds her footsteps on the tile and the ambient hum of the refrigeration. She worked the frozen section, the bakery, the dairy coolers, her hands moving with automatic precision while her mind catalogued what she'd seen in those incident reports. 3 similar patterns. 4, if you counted the one from early June. All phantom injuries. All billing errors that worked consistently in Pierce's favor. All signed off by a wellness consultant named Derek Pierce, who apparently had an unusually high number of workplace incidents on his watch. She could have said something more. Captain Rachel Torres, though no one here would ever call her that, had spent 12 years in the Army, 3 tours in Helmand Province with the 75th Ranger Regiment, and she'd learned how to read situations the way other people read grocery lists. The pattern was obvious. The fraud was obvious. But she also understood something else: she had no authority here. She was the overnight stocker with a nursing degree, grateful for minimum wage, exactly as Derek Pierce had assessed. In the break room, Rachel sat alone with her sandwich at 4:30 in the morning, the staff room fluorescent and institutional, the kind of space designed to discourage lingering. 2 other employees came in, Marcus, who worked produce during the day shift, and Keisha from the registers. They grabbed their meals from the lockers, nodded politely to Rachel, and left within 90 seconds. Fear was contagious at a workplace, especially when management had shown its teeth. Keisha and Marcus had seen how Pierce looked at Rachel. They understood the calculus. Association was risk. Rachel chewed her turkey sandwich alone, her hands perfectly steady, her breathing even, and allowed herself exactly 1 moment of irritation before locking it away. She'd hidden bigger things than anger. That was practically the definition of her life now. At 6 o'clock, she clocked out, changed back into her civilian clothes in the cramped locker room, and walked through the pre-dawn darkness to her car. The parking lot was empty except for the hum of lights and the distant sound of the city waking up. She sat in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, and opened the glove compartment. There it was. The flag. Folded into the precise triangle that Arlington Cemetery requires, the fabric worn soft from being touched, from being held, from being grieved. Sarah Chen. 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 years ago. Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley, the place that had stopped being a location on a map the moment Rachel's best friend had stopped breathing. She didn't cry. Captain Rachel Torres had trained herself against that particular luxury a long time ago. But she allowed herself 3 long, measured breaths, the kind of breathing she'd taught herself during her last deployment, when breathing was the difference between staying operational and falling apart. 1 breath in. Hold. 1 breath out. Again. And again. Then she closed the glove compartment, started the engine, and drove home through the quiet Atlanta streets, just another nurse who'd worked the overnight shift, just someone grateful for minimum wage and the ability to disappear into a job where no one asked questions and no one looked too closely at the woman in the produce section. What she didn't know was that Derek Pierce was already on his phone, already making strategic decisions about how to protect his operation, already calculating how to neutralize the threat that Rachel Torres represented. What Pierce didn't know was that the woman he dismissed as just a nurse had spent the last 3 years trying to stay invisible, trying to stay dead. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the only person at that Whole Foods who could have documented Pierce's fraud, the only person with the training and the credibility to make the evidence stick, was about to become far too useful to simply dismiss. The dairy cooler hum filled the aisle at 4 in the morning. Rachel Torres pushed her cart past rows of organic milk and plant-based butter, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that surgical white that made night shift feel like operating inside a freezer. The store was empty except for the overnight crew, 3 stockers, 1 cashier, 1 manager watching from above. Then the sound came. Not loud. Worse than loud. A wet crack followed by the solid thump of a body hitting tile. An elderly woman lay sprawled near the dairy section, her head at an angle that made Rachel's training snap into focus instantly. 73 years old, maybe 75. Grey hair. Blood pooling beneath her temple. Her eyes open but unfocused. Rachel was moving before conscious thought caught up. She dropped beside the woman, hands already assessing. "I'm a nurse," she said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Don't move. Don't try to get up." The woman's eyes tracked toward her voice. "Good." Pupils responding. Rachel placed one hand on either side of the woman's head, stabilizing the cervical spine with the precision of muscle memory that went back 17 years and 4 combat deployments. "What's your name?" "Margaret." "Margaret Chen." "Margaret, I need you to stay absolutely still. Can you do that for me?" "Yes." "Yes, I." "Don't talk. Just blink if you understand." 2 blinks. Slow. Controlled. Rachel ran through the protocol without speaking it aloud. Orientation intact. Pupils equal and reactive. No visible fracture, but the impact had been significant. The sound of that crack against tile, that was the kind of sound that could mean epidural hematoma, subarachnoid hemorrhage, worse. "How many fingers am I holding up?" Rachel held 2 fingers steady in Margaret's field of vision. 2. "Good. Any nausea? Any dizziness before the fall?" "No. My shoe caught the edge of the water. I didn't see it." Rachel's hands moved without instruction, checking for lacerations beyond the temple wound, assessing skull integrity with the gentleness of someone who had held dying soldiers in her arms. The bleeding was controlled but not insignificant. Head wounds always bled like that. Looked worse than they often were. Sometimes. Not always. She kept her breathing steady, kept her touch gentle, kept her voice the temperature of absolute calm. "We're going to get you transported to the hospital. You're going to be fine." One of the other stockers, Marcus, the young kid who stocked produce, was already on the radio calling 911. Rachel continued the assessment, checking Margaret's extremities for neurological response, asking questions that would establish a baseline for the paramedics, never once breaking contact with the woman's cervical spine. This was the work. This was what the nursing degree meant. Not arranging organic vegetables under fluorescent lights. This. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. Rachel briefed them while maintaining spinal stabilization. 60-second fall from standing, loss of consciousness unclear, moderate head laceration, alert and oriented times 3, pupils PERL, equal grips bilaterally, able to move all extremities on command. No complaints of neck or back pain, but cervical spine immobilization recommended given mechanism. The lead paramedic, name tag read Holloway, nodded with the respect of one professional recognizing another. "Good call stabilizing her before we arrived." "You medical?" "Nursing background," Rachel said, a phrase she had rehearsed for months. They loaded Margaret onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency, securing her cervical collar, running the fall line, preparing for transport. Rachel stepped back as they wheeled her toward the doors, her hand still steady, her expression unchanged. She had saved someone's life using skills that were now forbidden to her. She had done what she was trained to do. And somewhere above the sales floor, Dr. Pierce was watching from his office with the expression of a man who had just seen his threat become real. The walk to his office took 47 seconds. Rachel knew because she counted. A habit from the field, knowing your movement time, knowing your corridors, knowing your exits. Dr. Pierce sat behind his desk this time instead of standing, a calculated move designed to make her stand before him like a student before a principal. He was a man built like ambition in a $2,000 suit, the kind of man who had never been hungry and never would be. The kind of man who confused money with power. "You think that nursing degree makes you special," he said before she finished closing the door. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, casual menace built on an engine of institutional authority. "You're a stocker? Stock girl. That's your job description. You arrange products. You stock shelves. You don't diagnose. You don't treat. You don't play doctor. Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A muscle contracted for 1/8 of a second. Her hands remained at her sides, palms forward, completely still. Her breathing did not change. Her eyes did not leave his face. This was the composure of someone who had received gunfire without flinching, who had watched friends die without moving, who understood that showing anger was admitting defeat. "I helped someone who needed help," she said quietly. 10 words. Measured. No apology in the tone. "You created liability. You exposed this store to a lawsuit if anything goes wrong with that woman. If she sues us because of something you did." I stabilized her cervical spine and called an ambulance. That's standard first aid. You performed a medical assessment. You asked her questions about her neurological status. You used your nursing credentials. That's practicing medicine without authority. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a printed form. An incident report. He had prepared this before she even arrived. He had known exactly what he was going to do. Strategic. Competent. Calculated. You're receiving a final written warning. One more incident like this and you're terminated. She watched him fill out the form in black ink, watched him sign his name with the flourish of someone who never doubted his own authority. Then he stood and walked past her to the corridor, to the employee board by the time clock where every worker punched in and out. He pulled out a red marker and wrote in letters large enough to be read from the stockroom, "Torres, overstepping boundaries, final warning." Rachel stood in the corridor and watched her name become public record. Around her, the store hummed with fluorescent electricity. Someone was restocking the cereal aisle. Someone else was mopping the end cap. She had saved a woman's life at 4 o'clock in the morning, and now her name was posted like a disciplinary notice in red ink. She did not tremble. She did not turn away. She simply looked at the board for 5 seconds and then returned to stocking the international foods aisle, her movements precise and mechanical, her mind compartmentalized like a soldier's. The next night, she sat in the break room during her lunch break. 4 employees were eating: Marcus, Jennifer, David, and Tom. They were laughing about something, a joke someone had made. When Rachel unwrapped her sandwich and sat down at the table, the laughter stopped. Within 30 seconds, all 4 of them collected their food in an unspoken agreement and left. Not because they disliked her. Because Dr. Pierce had made it clear that association with Rachel Torres was a contagion. They didn't speak to her. They didn't make eye contact. They simply left. Rachel sat alone under the buzzing fluorescent tube and ate her sandwich with methodical bites, chewing carefully, swallowing, taking another bite. Her expression did not change. Her hands did not tremble. But inside, something shifted, not breaking, but settling into a different configuration, like a soldier reloading a magazine. She finished her sandwich in the empty break room and returned to work. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at the end of her shift, when Rachel sat in her car in the parking lot and opened the glove compartment. Inside, folded with military precision, was Sarah Chen's flag. Not a regular flag, the flag that had draped her casket at Arlington, folded into that perfect triangle that meant a soldier's death had been validated by the state. Rachel held it for 3 silent breaths, her hand steady, her eyes closed. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply held the flag and breathed and then carefully placed it back in the glove compartment and started the car. 3 nights later, Marcus Webb came through the store at 2 in the morning, moving with the careful precision of a man who had learned to occupy space without making noise. Rachel noticed him the way she noticed everything, his slight limp, the way his eyes scanned corners, the barely perceptible tension in his shoulders. He was Army. 75th Regiment, maybe, based on the bearing. He caught her watching and something passed between them, some recognition that existed below language. "Army?" he asked quietly. "A long time ago," Rachel said, her voice carefully neutral, every inflection controlled. "Ranger." 75th Regiment. Medic. Something flickered across her face for 1/10 of a second, a muscle memory of being known, of being recognized by someone who had walked the same roads. Then the mask returned. Thank you for your service. He studied her with the intensity of someone who recognized the tactical distance in her words. Helmand. Like I said. A long time ago. He moved on through the store, but his breathing seemed slightly labored. Rachel noticed, she always noticed. And what she noticed was that somewhere in the fluorescent-lit grocery store at 2 in the morning, there was another soldier carrying invisible wounds, moving carefully through civilian spaces, pretending to shop for food he probably didn't need. Above them, Dr. Pierce watched this interaction from his office and made a note on his tablet. This woman had too many connections. Too much awareness. Too much potential to become dangerous. He picked up his phone and dialed his cousin at the state medical board. Time to accelerate the timeline. 3 nights. That's how long Rachel waited before Marcus Webb came back. She knew he would. Not because she'd memorized his face, that was standard threat assessment, something she did with every customer who moved through the automatic doors. But she knew because she recognized the particular gait of a man carrying injuries that wouldn't kill him today but were absolutely planning to do it soon. The slight favor of his left leg. The way his breathing synchronized with his steps, like he was rationing oxygen the way soldiers ration ammunition in hostile territory. Rachel was 6 aisles away, stocking the international food section at 3 in the morning. The Whole Foods was a ghost ship at this hour, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical dirge, the smell of stale produce mixing with the antiseptic bite of floor cleaner. She'd arranged organic pasta in precise rows for 43 minutes when her peripheral vision caught him. Weathered man. 50s, maybe older if the Hellman sun had aged him the way it aged all of them. Civilian clothes that hung loose on a frame that had clearly once filled them differently. Canvas jacket over a faded long-sleeve shirt. Boots that weren't quite right for a grocery store run at midnight. His bearing gave him away immediately. Spine straight despite the limp. Shoulders set in that alignment that came from years of load-bearing, from rucking 60 pounds through mountains where the air was thin and the bullets were real. He moved through the aisles with the efficiency of a man who'd cleared hostile buildings, minimal wasted motion, awareness distributed through the entire space rather than focused on any single point. His eyes catalogued exit routes. His hand stayed free. Rachel's hands continued stocking. Berea. Banza. Tinkyada. Her fingers placed each box with the same mechanical precision they'd used to set up for lines and field dressings, but her breathing had shifted. Slower now. Deeper. She wasn't scanning for threats. She was reading vital signs from 3 aisles away, translating his body's broadcast into a clinical summary that her mind was assembling without her permission. The man's lips had a faint blue tinge. Cyanosis. Early stages. His respirations were elevated, she could count them from the rhythm of his movement, estimate he was pulling 25, maybe 28 breaths per minute when normal was 16. His left hand kept rising to his chest, not quite touching it, like he was monitoring something underneath the shirt. Pain. Or pressure. His gait was favoring the left side now, which meant his cardiovascular system was already starting to compensate, shunting blood away from extremities to preserve core function. He moved toward the pain medication aisle. Rachel turned to face the shelves in front of her, but her attention was no longer on Italian imports. She waited exactly 47 seconds, then turned the corner with a stack of boxes she didn't need to stock yet. She positioned herself 3 aisles over, 1 shelf back, completely visible if he looked but easily dismissed as just another overnight employee doing her job. He was leaning on the shelf now. Both hands gripping the metal edge. His breathing had accelerated further. The blue tinge at his lips was more pronounced. His jaw was clenched in that particular way that meant pain was information and he was trying to read the data without reacting to the message. She'd seen this pattern before. In Helmand Province. In Phi Base Nomad's aid station when rangers came back from compounds that had gone hot. The physiological cascade that started with a small bleed progressed to fluid accumulation and ended in respiratory decompensation if nobody intervened. Rachel moved toward him. Not fast. Not urgent. Just a grocery employee passing through, stacking boxes on nearby shelves, getting close enough that her voice would reach him without traveling far. "Sir, you should sit down." He didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the shelves in front of him, on bottles of ibuprofen and naproxen sodium. "You're showing signs of respiratory distress." Now he looked at her. His eyes were brown, steady, intelligent. Eyes that had seen things. His gaze held hers for exactly 2 seconds before sliding away. "I'm fine. Just tired." It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. But his lips were still blue, and his left hand was rising toward his chest again, and Rachel had spent 7 years of her life keeping men like this alive against their own goddamned stubbornness. "Your O2 sat is dropping. I can see it in your color. You need Torres. My office. Now." Dr. Pierce's voice came from somewhere behind the pasta aisle, sharp as a scalpel, cutting through the fluorescent hum. Rachel didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the man in front of her. His breathing had stopped for exactly 1 beat, a reflex, a flinch, an acknowledgement that the sound of authority had its own weight. "This man needs medical attention," Rachel said. Quiet. Matter of fact. The same tone she would use to order blood products or request a ventilator. "My office." Pierce's face appeared at the end of the aisle, and it was the color of overripe plum. "Or you're terminated immediately." The weathered man straightened with visible effort, pulling his shoulders back, sucking in a breath that had to cost him. "I'm okay. Really. Don't lose your job for me." Rachel's jaw set. Not tight enough to be visible, but tight enough that she felt her teeth meet. Her hand stayed steady. They always stayed steady. She'd held a 7-year-old's liver in her hands while bullets came through the windows. She'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife and kept a man breathing until the helicopter arrived. Her hands didn't know how to shake. She turned away from the blue-lipped ranger and walked toward Pierce's office. Each step measured. Each movement deliberate. The grocery store floor was slick with floor wax, but her boots gripped it like she was walking on traction. She could feel Pierce behind her, could hear his breathing, elevated, triumphant, the sound of a man who'd just won a small battle. Inside his office, the door closed with a soft pneumatic hiss. The smell of stale coffee and his cologne, something expensive and cloying, the kind of scent that didn't belong in a place that was supposed to save lives, filled the small space. His desk was mounted on the wall above the sales floor, giving him a clear view of the entire store. She could see the international foods aisle from here. She could see where the weathered man had been standing. Pierce was already on his phone, his cursor hovering over her personnel file on the screen behind him. She could see the document from where she stood. Torres. His voice was into the phone, not at her. "Yes, I'm the manager. I've documented her pattern of insubordination. I've submitted a report to corporate about her medical practice without licensure, and yes, I understand the liability implications." His eyes found hers. "One more incident, stock girl, and you're gone. And I'll make sure no grocery chain in Georgia ever hires you again." He was still talking to corporate. She was listening to both conversations, his and the electronic voice on the other end, but she wasn't processing the words. She was watching the sales floor behind him. The weathered man was walking toward the exit. Slow. Deliberate. Like he was conserving oxygen. "You're off the clock for the next week," Pierce was saying. "Consider it a cooling-off period." Rachel turned and left his office without acknowledging the order. The way you leave a combat briefing, not hostile, not compliant, just gone. She moved back to the sales floor, scanning the aisles. The international food section was empty. She walked the perimeter of the store, produce, meat, dairy, but he was already gone. just the automatic doors hissing their pneumatic sigh where he'd exited. In the parking lot, she found him leaning against a truck. Not moving. Just breathing. His eyes were closed, his left hand pressed against his chest, and his breathing had become something fractured and uncertain. Each inhalation seemed to require a conversation with his body, a negotiation, a reminder that oxygen was still worth fighting for. "I'm calling 911, Rachel said. His eyes opened. Unfocused. His lips were nearly grey now. No. No hospitals. Can't afford the bills. Get in the truck. Just need to get home. He said it like it was an option. Like his body wasn't already making decisions he couldn't override. Rachel watched him pull open the truck door with both hands, the way a man moves when his central nervous system is sending out distress signals and he's pretending not to hear them. He climbed in. Turned the key. The engine caught with a mechanical groan. Rachel stepped back. She didn't move. She didn't follow. She stood in the parking lot at 3:15 in the morning and watched a medical emergency drive itself away, and she did absolutely nothing about it except memorize the license plate, the way soldiers memorize routes through hostile territory, the way nurses catalog the faces of patients they're about to lose, and think about how Captain Rachel Torres didn't exist anymore, which meant she couldn't be the one to save him. The rain started as she walked back to her car. Not gentle. Atlanta rain, hard and sudden, like the sky had made a decision and wasn't interested in negotiation. The smell of hot asphalt and ozone mixed with diesel exhaust and something else, the particular metallic scent of a storm rolling in from somewhere far away. She sat in her car for 7 minutes with the engine off, rain hammering the roof like applause, and pulled out her phone. The photos were still there. Derek Pierce's incident reports. The fraudulent claims. The pattern that had been so obvious to her in the Helmand Province Patrol Base, obvious to her now in a parking lot in Atlanta at 3 in the morning. She could report it tomorrow. She could walk into the store manager's office and lay out every discrepancy, every phantom injury, every dollar that had been skimmed from the workers' compensation pool and diverted into Pierce's account. She had the evidence. She had the clarity. But whistleblowers needed credibility, and Captain Rachel Torres had been scrubbed from federal records like she'd never existed. She'd been ordered into hiding by Pentagon lawyers who'd told her that her name was classified, that her service was classified, that the only survival strategy was invisibility. She could report Derek Pierce, but the moment her name appeared on an official complaint, something in a federal database was going to flag, and then the lawyers would come, and then the whole careful architecture of her new life would collapse. Rachel pulled out of the parking lot and drove home through the rain, knowing that the weathered man in the truck was going to need saving, knowing that Captain Rachel Torres couldn't be the one to do it, knowing that sometimes the most dangerous thing about being a ghost is that you have to watch people drown while you stay invisible. The rain kept falling. Hard. Relentless. The kind of rain that didn't care who was watching. The rain came back the next night, softer this time, almost apologetic against the Whole Foods windows. Rachel was restocking the organic dairy section when she heard the automatic doors wheeze open at 11:41 p.m. Marcus Webb. She recognized him immediately, the slight drag in his left leg more pronounced than 3 nights ago, the way his right hand gripped the cart like it was the only thing keeping him upright. She didn't look directly. That was the rule she'd written for herself years ago in Helmand Province: observe without being observed. Watch the perimeter. Calculate threats and advantages. Never let them know you're counting their respirations. But she was counting now. Marcus moved through the store with the kind of deliberate precision that came from managing pain. His lips had a faint bluish tint, cyanosis creeping in at the margins. His breathing was audible from 40 feet away, a wet rasp like he was dragging his lungs through broken glass. Rachel had treated pulmonary edema in combat conditions before. She knew what the sound meant. Fluid. Pressure. Time running out like sand through a closed fist. She positioned herself near the produce section, close enough to keep him in her peripheral vision, far enough that she wouldn't trigger Derek Pierce's paranoia. Pierce had been watching her since the elderly customer incident. She could feel his eyes from the office above the sales floor, always calculating, always measuring her as a liability that needed to be contained. Which is exactly what Pierce did at midnight. He emerged from the office stairwell and intercepted Rachel near the lettuce bins. His voice was low, conversational, the tone of a manager making a reasonable request. "I'm reassigning you to the stockroom tonight. We need inventory reconciliation in the back. You're detailed to that section until close." Rachel registered the move instantly. The stockroom was in the rear of the building, sealed off from the main sales floor. She would lose visual contact with Marcus Webb. She would lose her ability to intervene if his condition deteriorated. She would be exactly where Pierce wanted her, isolated, out of sight, unable to help. "The dairy section is my assigned." "That was yesterday's assignment," Pierce said, his smile sharp as a scalpel. "We rotate." "You understand rotation, I'm sure." Very military concept. Adaptability. The word hung between them. He knew. Or he suspected. Rachel had been careful. Military bearing doesn't just disappear because you wear a name tag instead of rank insignia, but careful wasn't the same as invisible. In a grocery store with fluorescent lights that bleached away all shadows, invisibility was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Stockroom," Pierce repeated. "Now." Rachel nodded, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She walked toward the back, her stride controlled, her hand steady. She didn't look at Marcus Webb. She didn't look at the stockroom door. She just moved, the way a soldier moves when they've been outmaneuvered and need to find higher ground. But higher ground in a grocery store stockroom was limited. The stockroom was a cavern of metal shelves and industrial lighting, the kind of space that smelled like cardboard and the faint chemical ghost of industrial sanitizer. Rachel pulled up the inventory system on the handheld device Pierce had shoved at her, her fingers moving through the motions. Recount. Reconcile. Account for every item as if items mattered. As if anything mattered except the man in the store who was slowly suffocating while she stood in a back room separated from him by 60 feet of linoleum and one closed door. At 12:33 a.m., Pierce appeared in the stockroom doorway. "New policy," he said, holding up a printed sheet with the satisfaction of a general deploying fresh troops. "All medical observations require supervisor approval before action. You see something that looks medical, you report to me first. I'll evaluate. I'll decide if intervention is necessary. You take no action without my explicit authorization. Clear?" Rachel read the policy. It was brilliant, in a toxic way. It transformed her into a witness instead of a responder. It made her medical knowledge a liability instead of an asset. It made Derek Pierce the gatekeeper of every decision that mattered. "Clear," Rachel said. "Good. Because the next time you operate outside the chain of command, you'll be terminated. I don't care what kind of special background you think you have. You're a stalker? That's all you are here." He left. Rachel stood motionless for 3 seconds, her hands pressed against the cold metal shelf, her breathing controlled through her nose. The fluorescent light above her hummed its mechanical drone. Somewhere in the building, Marcus Webb was shopping. Somewhere in his chest, a heart was working harder than it was designed to work, pushing against the damage that Helmand Province had carved into his body. And she was locked in a stockroom with an inventory sheet. At 1:15 a.m., Rachel made her decision. She left the stockroom under the pretext of fetching additional supplies, moving through the store with the purposeless shuffle of an employee doing her job. She positioned herself near the cereal aisle, close enough to the main sales floor to keep Marcus in her line of sight. Close enough that she could see him without appearing to see him. The stockroom assignment meant she shouldn't be on the sales floor at all, but Pierce was in his office, his attention split between his computer and whatever fraud calculations occupied his evenings. Marcus was in the refrigerated section, his breathing more labored now. Rachel watched his chest rise and fall, shallow, rapid, desperate pulls of air that weren't enough. His left hand was trembling as he reached for a bottle of water. Not from cold. From hypoxia. His blood wasn't getting oxygen, and his body was screaming about it in the only language it had left. She remained in the cereal aisle, a ghost in an employee vest, her medical training at war with her classified status. She could call for help. She could pretend she knew CPR from a YouTube video and perform rescue breathing. She could break every protocol that kept her invisible. She could do nothing. Above her, visible through the office glass, Derek Pierce leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He'd neutralized the threat. He'd isolated her from the patient. He'd instituted a chain of command that would keep her from acting without his permission. He'd done what managers do when they sense a challenge to their authority. He'd restructured the system to eliminate it. He had no idea that his threat assessment was correct. That the woman in the cereal aisle had 19 hours of combat command experience. That she'd held a fire base alone against coordinated assault. That she'd kept 14 soldiers alive through sheer force of will and medical knowledge while waiting for extraction that came 6 hours too late. He'd restructured the system to keep her powerless, not understanding that a woman who'd been declared dead by the Pentagon couldn't be neutralized by a grocery store manager with an inventory sheet and a new policy. Rachel waited until Pierce's attention drifted back to his computer. Then she walked directly toward the refrigerated section, her posture casual, her pace unhurried. If Pierce glanced down, she would appear to be stocking shelves. If Marcus Webb noticed her, he would see just another employee. She positioned herself 3 shelves away from him, her hands moving through the motions of work while her eyes tracked the subtle deterioration in his vital signs. The cyanosis was deepening. His breathing was becoming more labored, the rhythm irregular. His skin had taken on that particular pallor that came when a heart was failing to pump adequate blood to the extremities. She was violating Pierce's new policy. She was on the sales floor when she'd been assigned to the stockroom. She was observing medical symptoms and not reporting them to her supervisor. She was violating every structure he'd built to contain her. But she was there. And when Marcus Webb's knees buckled at 1:08 a.m., when his body began its collapse toward the linoleum floor, Rachel Torres would be the closest person to him. Policy or no policy. Assignment or no assignment. Permission or no permission. Derek Pierce watched from his office, satisfied that he'd finally implemented a system that worked. He had no idea that the most dangerous people in any environment are the ones with nothing left to lose, the ones whose identities have already been erased by governments and bureaucracies, the ones who'd learned that sometimes you have to break the rules you were given because the rules were designed to make you powerless. The fluorescent lights hummed. The rain continued its soft assault on the windows. And Rachel Torres waited in her isolation, a captain without a rank, a soldier without a war, finally in position to do what she did best. 3:47 in the morning. Aisle 7. The frozen foods hummed their mechanical dirge as Rachel restocked the organic freezer section, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The overnight shift stretched quiet around her, just the fluorescent lights casting their pale wash across the tile, just the sound of her own measured breathing, just the waiting. She had positioned herself here deliberately. The produce section had become a minefield since Derek Pierce's reassignment mandate, but frozen foods belonged to nobody. No manager overhead. No witnesses except the security cameras, and those recorded in loops, 28 minutes of dead footage every 2 hours. She knew the timing by heart. The automatic doors hissed open at 3:27 a.m. Rachel's shoulders remained still, but her peripheral vision tracked the figure stumbling through the entrance. Marcus Webb moved like a man walking through water, each step a negotiation with his own body, his breathing audible even from 30 feet away. Cyanosis darkening the skin beneath his jaw. Sweat beading on his forehead despite the 42-degree chill of the refrigerated section. His hand gripped the shopping cart rail as if it were the only thing keeping him vertical. Rachel had seen this progression for 3 days now. She had watched him deteriorate with the clinical detachment of a medic reading vital signs, and she had known, with the absolute certainty of someone who had treated battlefield traumas intense without electricity, exactly what was happening inside his chest. A blood clot. Likely deep vein thrombosis from his combat injuries, probably from his left leg, and now it was traveling. Migrating. A piece of him had broken off and was journeying toward his lungs like a piece of shrapnel, still finding targets hours after the firing had stopped. He made it to aisle 7. 3 steps. Then his body simply stopped negotiating. Marcus Webb's knees buckled with the sudden weight of physics, his hand releasing the cart, his body collapsing onto the tile like a building losing its structural integrity all at once. The sound was terrible, not the crack of bone, but something worse, the wet percussion of impact and the sharp intake of breath that meant his lungs had just understood they were drowning. Rachel was already moving. The frozen foods forgotten. Her shoes gripped the tile like a combat boot finding purchase on mountain stone. She covered the distance between them in 4.2 seconds, muscle memory and training overriding the careful camouflage of the past 8 months. No hesitation. No permission. Just the tactical assessment running parallel to her movement: male, early 40s, respiratory distress, probable massive pulmonary embolism, no pulse in the carotid artery, pupils dilated, skin the color of wet concrete. She knelt beside him. Her hands moved on their own, hands that had held compression bandages against chest wounds in the mountains of Helmand Province, hands that had felt for exit wounds in the dark, hands that remembered everything they had been trained to do. "Stay with me," she said, her voice the calm of someone who had already survived the worst. "I've got you." Around them, the grocery store was waking up. A customer in the cereal aisle turned, saw the collapsed man, and their phone came up immediately. Rachel didn't register them. Her fingers found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into muscle memory from training that had never actually been erased, just hidden. A 14-gauge needle. She didn't have one. She had something better. The trauma shears lived in her jacket pocket, equipment she should never have possessed, equipment that violated every protocol of her carefully constructed invisibility. But some things you don't surrender. Some skills you don't retire. She had kept them for exactly this reason, for the moment when hiding became irrelevant, when the choice between exposure and watching someone die became no choice at all. The shears hissed as they opened, cutting through his shirt, exposing the pale skin and the ribs beneath. Pain was information. Pain was the body's way of saying something had changed. Rachel understood pain with the intimacy of someone who had felt it articulate itself through her own tissue. She sterilized the knife blade with alcohol from the first aid kit that management had forgotten was mounted on the wall 2 aisles over, the one no one ever checked. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. The needle decompression took 6.3 seconds. The hollow pen, she had hollowed it that afternoon with the precision of a surgeon, became the conduit. Air hissed out of his chest cavity with a sound like releasing pressure from a tire, the desperate pneumothorax collapsing, his lungs suddenly able to expand again. His gasping stopped. His color began the slow migration back toward human. O2 sat. Someone was shouting. The customer. They were filming. Rachel could see the phone's camera pointed at her, could see the light reflecting off Marcus Webb's pallid face, could see the digital record of everything about to happen materializing like evidence against her. She didn't care. The parasympathetic system doesn't negotiate with consequences. Derek Pierce arrived before the paramedics. He arrived like a storm system with a dress code, his face the color of a thunderhead, his voice the boom of something about to break. "What in God's name are you doing?" His words echoed through the fluorescent-lit morning, bouncing off tile and freezer doors. "You cannot practice medicine. You are not a doctor. I don't care if you studied at Johns Hopkins, you are stocking shelves and nothing more." Rachel didn't look at him. Her hands remained on Marcus Webb's chest, feeling the rhythm stabilize beneath her palms, feeling the breath return to something approximating normal. "Call an ambulance," she said quietly. "You're fired." Pierce's voice was a gun going off. "Effective immediately. You have violated every policy, every protocol, every standard of care in this establishment. I am calling our legal team. I am calling the insurance company. Liable. You have made us liable, and I will see to it that every hospital in Georgia knows you performed an authorized medical." The ambulance arrived. The paramedics came with their equipment and their certifications and their legal authority, and they looked at Rachel with the question every medic recognizes: another medic who already did the hardest part. She stepped back. Her hands fell away from Marcus Webb's ribs. She had done what needed doing. Now came the price. Derek Pierce was already on his phone. Rachel could see him pacing toward his office, his voice sharp and commanding, the particular tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need corporate to blacklist her immediately. Rachel Torres. Hired 2 months ago as a night shift stalker. She performed unauthorized medical procedures today on a customer. I don't care about her qualifications, we need her name flagged in every system we maintain." His mouth was moving like a machine that had learned to generate consequences. "Yes, I'll hold." The paramedics had Marcus Webb on the stretcher now. They were moving with the controlled urgency of people who understood the situation, and they didn't ask Rachel any questions because they already understood what had happened. One of them caught her eye for a moment, a look of professional recognition, and then he was gone, and the doors were closing behind him, and Rachel was standing in the middle of aisle 7 with fluorescent lights humming overhead and Derek Pierce's voice echoing down from his office like a judge pronouncing sentence. Security arrived within 8 minutes. Not aggressive, just firm and procedural. They escorted her to the employee locker room, where she retrieved her jacket and the small bag of personal items she had permitted herself. Her employee badge was taken from her with the solemnity of a medal being stripped after court-martial. The folded flag from Sarah Chen, the one constant she had carried through 8 months of invisibility, remained in her jacket pocket. Security didn't search. They were just following protocol, just doing their job, just participating in the machinery of erasure. By 3 in the morning, Rachel Torres was sitting in a Waffle House on Ponce de Leon Avenue, staring at her reflection in the window glass and wondering if this was how ghosts felt. Her coffee had grown cold 40 minutes ago. It was the color of dirty water now, a surface that reflected nothing, a drink that had lost its utility without gaining any dignity. The diner was empty except for a man at the counter who didn't look up from his newspaper. The waitress refilled cups without making eye contact. This was the time of night when nobody asked questions because nobody had the energy to care. She had been erased before. Operation Phantom Ridge had seen to that, the Pentagon lawyers and the classified debriefs and the decision that Captain Rachel Torres was too much of a liability to exist. But she had accepted that erasure. She had signed the papers. She had understood the weight of what she had done in those mountains, understood that some things were too dark to surface, that some operations were better forgotten. But this was different. This was Derek Pierce's calculated decision to delete her from the world she inhabited. This was a man with access to corporate systems and regulatory bodies, a man who could call his cousin at the health department and fabricate a complaint, a man who could turn the machinery of ordinary bureaucracy into a weapon. And it had worked. By dawn, she would be flagged in 17 different databases. Unauthorized medical practice. Liability concern. Employment risk. The architecture of her invisibility would transform into a prison. She couldn't apply for nursing positions without drawing federal attention. She couldn't work in hospitals without triggering alerts. She couldn't even work as a paramedic or an EMT without the background check machinery recognizing her classified SSN and initiating a cascade of questions she couldn't answer. The folded flag felt heavier in her pocket than it had that morning. Sarah Chen had died holding a position in the mountains of Helmand Province, had died without ever knowing if her sacrifice would matter, if anyone would remember her, if the mission would even be acknowledged. And Rachel had carried that flag through 8 months of invisibility, had kept it safe like a sacred object, and for what? So she could stock shelves and watch people suffer and look at her reflection in a Waffle House window at 4 in the morning wondering if she had failed everyone who ever counted on her? The waitress refilled her cup without asking. Cold coffee becoming hot again. Rachel didn't drink it. She just stared at it, at the steam rising like something trying to escape, like some part of her was trying to ascend and leave the rest of the body behind. Outside, Atlanta slept. Somewhere in the Georgia darkness, a man named Marcus Webb was in an ambulance moving toward emergency surgery, his lungs still full of air because she had made the choice to be seen. Somewhere in a federal building, Derek Pierce was sleeping soundly, unaware that he had just triggered every alarm in a classified military database. She left cash on the table and walked to her car in the parking lot. The night air was cool against her face, the kind of cool that feels like a reset, like the world is drawing breath and preparing for something it doesn't yet understand. Rachel sat in the driver's seat and didn't turn the key. She just sat there, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and allowed herself 3 seconds to be exactly as afraid as she needed to be. Then she started the engine. The dashboard lights came alive. And Captain Rachel Torres, formerly Rachel, currently nobody, soon to be infamous, drove toward her apartment through the sleeping city, toward the moment when the world would finally learn what it meant to erase someone who had been designed to survive any circumstance. The question was no longer whether she would survive. The question was whether anyone was ready for what happened next. If you've made it this far, you know the kind of person who shows up when everyone else is running away. Subscribe for more untold stories of the quietly lethal, the hidden heroes living next to you, the ones who change everything without ever asking for credit. Like this video, leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Rachel's position, and hit that notification bell because some stories demand to be heard.